That's the down arrow.
Okay, and then it just appears.
If you forget, then I'll just come up and I'll do
I'm
it for you.
determined to be very quick. Whenever I've been almost about to learn, it's always been something that mattered so much that I didn't want to be.
Yeah, not a problem.
Yet.
Yeah, not a problem. Okay, we're ready to get started. So if you could please take a seat. Okay, let's get things started. My name is Alex Abecina, and I am a PhD candidate here at the University of Cambridge studying patristics. And it is my great delight and privilege to be chairing this, the final panel of lectures for the New Trinitarian Ontologies Conference. I almost said the first New Trinitarian Ontologies Conference, but we haven't got that far yet. I want to take this opportunity to say a special thank you as a co-organizer of this conference to you in particular for your engagement and your participation in what has been a wonderful conference that has far exceeded our expectations for it. And in particular, I wanted to thank you for the warm and friendly and joyful atmosphere that you have contributed to producing here at this conference. Who would have thought that New Trinitarian Ontologies and a friendly atmosphere would have gone together, but it has. And so thank you for contributing to that. And a number of people have commented on what a difference that has made to this conference, so thank you. Let's get things underway. And our first speaker today is David Bentley Hart. He has of late been a Director's Fellow in Residence of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Studies. In 2017 to 2018, he served as the NDIAS's Assistant Director of Undergraduate Research Assistance. Previously, he was appointed as the visiting Danforth Chair of St. Louis University. He has also held positions at the University of Virginia, Duke University, and as the visiting Robert J. Randall Chair at Providence College. Among Professor Hart's many scholarly books are The Beauty of the Infinite, 2003, The Doors of the Sea, 2005, Atheist Delusions, 2009, The Experience of God, 2013, That All Shall Be Saved, 2019, and the forthcoming Theological Territories, due to be published in 2020. He will be delivering a paper titled A Certain Gnostic Irony. Please welcome David Bentley Hart. I'll start it for you.
I can hit a start button. I can do all sorts of things. I apologize that the paper, first of all, thanks to everyone, but we have little time, so that's all I'm going to say. But especially thanks to Ryan. He is an indefatigable dynamo. I'm afraid this paper is not in any way going to reflect the title of the section we're having, because I didn't know what the title of the session was when I decided what to talk about. So to give it the proper aesthetic quality, I'm going to perform it as a dramatic oratorio. Sir Peter Pears and Dame Edith Sitwell, under the baton of Sir Thomas Beecham, scored by Sir William Walton. I'm not going to talk about Hegel, though I'll be talking about Hegel a bit, but I'm not really talking about him so much as how he's been received in theological history as a bone of contention. If I wanted to talk about him, I would wait until Vittorio Hösler was not in the room for fear of seeming like a fool. But it seems to me that Hegel's system poses a challenge to Christian self-understanding, or at least historically has done, with many regarding it as the most pernicious of alien accretions on the language of Christian orthodoxy, a, quote, false double that has subverted faith's proper grammar, or instead a natural development from principles that might being called a false double, while others have regarded it or treated it as a natural development from principles that might broadly be called orthodox. Excuse the jet lag. I happen to think the latter to be the case, but in that I intend neither any particular praise nor any particular censure. I just mean that what Hegel presents us with and has done for some centuries now is an occasion, among other things, to pose questions of our orthodoxies. Some of you may know that I've argued in the past that the 4th century defeat of the older, largely Alexandrian Trinitarianism by Nicene Constantinopolitan orthodoxy, and particularly the definition of the co-equality of the divine persons, brought about a philosophical revolution that was inadvertent but inevitable, and one that radically altered the destiny of Christian metaphysics. Until then, just to rehearse the argument in brief, most Eastern metaphysical schools, pagan, Jewish, or Christian, concurred in thinking that the liaison between the divine and this world took the form of what can be called a subordinationist hierarchy. I have no problem with that language, but I agree with Ilaria Romelli, not in regard to origin, really. In this system, God Most High, the Father, the One, who, however, dwelt in inaccessible transcendence, expressing himself or itself ad extra only in derivative, secondary, divine principles. The interval, or metaxitis, between the immanent and the transcendent, it was assumed, was inhabited by intermediary realities constituting at once a hypostatic continuum and a qualitative disjunction between the there above and the here below. And each of these secondary realities must be a sort of economic embassy, sufficiently reduced in nature to enter into contact with discrete beings. But the disproportion between the supreme principle of reality and every principle of manifestation remained absolute. Now, none of these systems, to contract 40 pages of argument into 3 sentences, had any real concept of being as distinct from beings in the sense recognizable to later Western thought. Each had some sort of being principle, but only as a kind of hypostasis or entity within the hierarchy of emanations, a discrete principle among other principles. Nowhere in this tradition did anyone clearly descry what we would think of as a real ontological difference or an analogical interval, or formulate a truly ontological account of divine transcendence. But what unfolded from Nicaea was at first the concept of the Logos not as a lesser manifestation of a God who is himself beyond all manifestation, but rather the eternal reality of God's manifestation of his own essence to himself. The perfectly proportionate convertibility of the Father with his own manifestation of himself to himself is God's own act of self-knowledge and self-love, as this tradition unfolded. Thus, his essence is infinite intelligibility. Even his hiddenness, his transcendence, is always already manifestation. And so obviously, if it's correct to understand being as in some sense convertible with manifestation or intelligibility, and there's a good pre-existing Platonic tradition, Neoplatonic tradition that says this, then it is also correct to say that the God who is always also co-equal logos is also eternal being. And once the notion of that graduated hierarchy of mediations between the world and its absolute principle had been abandoned, it became possible to understand true transcendence not merely as ontic supremacy. It is the wholly transcendent God in himself who directly creates rather than through an economic reduction of his power in lesser principles. Rather than the supreme being at the summit of the hierarchy of beings, he's transcendently present in all beings, the infinite act within and beyond every finite act, the immediate source of the being of the whole who is at the same time infinitely beyond the whole, even in its highest principles. In discovering then that God is not situated within an ontic continuum with creation, Christian thought also discovered him to be truly the ontological cause of creation, whatever that mysterious idea would mean. The full difference of being from beings became visible in Christian tradition at first as God's true transcendence of and intimate immediacy to creation. And thus creation and the history of salvation unfold within God, in some sense, within God as Trinity, within the Spirit's life, the Logos' rationality and manifestation, the Father's limitless self-expression in eternity and in time. And here, certain speculative possibilities once prominent in Christian thought were foreclosed, perhaps forever, while other possibilities opened up for the first time, among them one that genuinely reached one of its supreme expressions in Hegel's thought. Now, if I wanted to be flippant about Hegel, and would one dare, yes, I might say that Hegel's most radiant insight in this regard was to recognize that any philosophical impasse or question can be negotiated as a binary and oscillating opposition. Or he had an insight, at least, that he was able to translate into the most comprehensive, most finely calibrated conceptual machine in philosophical history. Where else have the worlds of Heraclitus and Parmenides achieved such exquisite equilibrium, each not merely complementing, but also implying and requiring the other? And what other vision of reality in both the abstract and the concrete, the necessary and the contingent, has been so capable of accommodating any revolution of thought? Even the most thoroughgoing rejection of the system can be recuperated again as a negation already comprised within its own logic. And this machine was set in motion by a simple spring of vertical contraction, one could argue. Again, if one were being flippant, remember that. Where traditional thought, Western thought had presumed the ontological and analogical median of that inviolable metaphysics, or interval between the transcendent and the immanent, which kept each firmly in its place, the absolute and the conditional, Hegel discovered that its collapse, not its total collapse, but its dynamical collapse, could perhaps produce a perhaps more comprehensive logic. He also perhaps discovered a law of historical development, which is to say what seem often like great peripeties and innovations and subversions in the course of philosophical history are quite likely nothing of the sort. Most intellectual revolutions are really only natural evolutions, most violent convulsions just the predictable effects of inertia, most heresies merely the fully ripened fruit of orthodoxies. And what they produce is rarely something entirely novel. It's rather a Wiederkehr des Verdrängten, a return of the repressed, by which the hidden negation that every philosophical principle conceals within itself breaks forth, demanding to be affirmed in its own right, and then strives to assume a dominant station in the hierarchy of truths. What has been determines what is to come, as the negated becomes the posited, and the principle that once prevailed becomes a repressed memory. If I wanted to be flippant. We can see why the Hegelian construal of the Christian story has been so jarring for many, even as it has seemed so liberating for others. Certainly it was not unreasonable to lament the contraction of that analogical interval between transcendent and immanent. Perhaps in the classical understanding of the immanent Trinity's expression in the economic is supplanted when is supplanted by the notion that the economic trinity somehow, if not constitutes, at least is logically indiscernible from the ultimate spiritual actuality of the immanent trinity. The nature of God becomes war rather than peace, or both war and peace. The abstract form of high Trinitarianism, it remains fixed, God's paternal depth manifesting in knowing itself in the generation of the Logos, returning to itself in the satiety of spirit. But reasonably, one might ask, has the space of grace disappeared and with it God's innocence? Is not then the Hegelian divine's nature not only simply expressed on the cross, but actually fashioned through the probative negation of crucifixion as such, or through every conflict arising from the contradictions and limitations of finitude, and therefore one in which that violence is necessarily, tragically, comically, ironically eternalized in its sublation and Geist. So again, you can see why one might fear this becoming an acceptable dimension of our understanding of Christian orthodoxy. And in fact, it's something of a scholarly commonplace to locate Hegel's thought in, if not a genealogy, at least an occult affinity with various so-called heterodox schools of the Christian past. Much of what we think we know about the late antique systems we call Gnosticism, for instance, was shaped long ago by scholars like Neander and Bauer, who read the record through the violet-tinted spectacles of German idealism. And in recent years, there have been critics of Hegel again who've claimed that the system constitutes a, quote, Gnostic return in modernity. Among them scholars, many scholars I greatly admire, but with whom I disagree. And yet Hegel's use of the Christian story might better be characterized as one perfect culmination of official orthodoxy's long attempt not merely to suppress, but completely to eradicate a certain Gnostic dimension within Christian self-imagination, self-understanding, as that is an exceedingly pure specimen of what remains of a certain stream of what we can broadly call orthodoxy when it's been wholly purged of every Gnostic irony. The Gnostic schools, as described by Bauer and Neander, never existed. They never could have done in the late antiquity. The Valentinians, the Basilidians, the Sethians were not precursors of, say, Boehme's theology or the Middle Schelling's metaphysics, much less Hegel's thought. And yet, many scholars do persist in repeating the claim that the ancient so-called Gnostics, and I'm not, whether that's even a useful category is another argument, that the ancient Gnostics spoke of a divine fall involving even God Most High, of the emergence of evil or defect from God's depths, of a redemption that effects not only a restoration, but even an advance towards fullness within God. Or of a Gnostic, or basically this claim that there is such a thing as a Gnostic theogonic narrative, and this is false. It's based on a misunderstanding of the plasticity of the term divine in late antiquity and on a failure to grasp the absolute distinction in all these systems between the inaccessible Father or God, as specified by the definite article, or theos, and the created or emanated divine, celestial, supercelestial, or aeonian realm. Some sects did speak of a fall within the heavenly pleroma and of Sophia's departure from it because of her inordinate desire to know the Father and himself, but the pleroma is not God or part of God in his transcendence, nor is God's identity involved in either its fall or its redemption. God is beyond all cosmic and heavenly orders, fallen or unfallen. Some texts also tell of God generating lower realities through his aeneia, the intellection with him in the beginning, just as Christian orthodoxy speaks of the Father creating through his logos. Some speak of the Father knowing himself reflectively, seeing himself in himself or in his own eternal light, just as later orthodoxy speaks of the logos as the Father's eternal self-knowledge. But none even hints that the Father enters into, suffers, or recovers from a divine crisis within the Godhead, or that his creative or emanative self-manifestation is his discovery of his own inherent potencies or the unfolding of the as yet indeterminate wisdom. I, in the footnotes here, have 160 citations to prove it. I will go over them when I go a little over. I don't know. The Father, or the monad, or ovithos, remains untouched by his creatures, even the most divine among them. And while in all these systems there is some catastrophe in the heavenly or aeonian, plurimatic, or divine places above, rebel angels, spirits falling through ethereal spaces, the mutiny of the world's angelic governors, an allegorized expulsion from Eden, the truancy of Sophia, in each, God, in the proper sense, remains immune to change and innocent of all evil. In a sense, what we call the Gnostic schools were extreme expressions, bedizened with often tediously opulent mythologies, of a dualistic theological register present in most spiritual systems of their time, Jewish, Christian, or pagan, and conspicuously present in the Pauline corpus and the Fourth Gospel. Where the Christians, who we call Gnostics now, seem eccentric is in amplifying a provisional, qualified dualism into a genuine ontological schism, such that creation has no natural relation to the Father at all, even in his eternal intentions. Thus, here below the planetary spheres, all is governed by fate, imarmeni, rather than providence, rather than the Platonic metaxites between transcendent and immanent and the metaphysics of participation. It permitted, these schools provided a mythology of exile and rescue across the distance of an absolute estrangement. But they did not think of salvation history as something that contributed to divine self-awakening, much less something that in a radically altered form would be the transformation of the implicit truth of the eternal concept into the explicit living wisdom of Geist. The Father in his hyper-Uranian inaccessibility is eternally the same. None of this is his story because he has no story. I'm never going to get to the end in time, so I'm going to stop the clock. For the Gnostics, then, the fall was not a fecundating negation, but a fall, adding nothing to divine reality, bearing no spiritual fruit. And it's precisely this Gnostic dimension of sullen suspicion and restless rebellion, this dualist intuition of the absolute vacuity, irredeemable falsehood, and inimical malice of the world that's wholly absent from any truly Hegelian construal of the Christian narrative. The orthodoxy's providential understanding of cosmic history remains intact. Valentinus would be as out of place in the system as a Chinese dragon in a cuckoo clock. So that's a funny line, so you must learn. So then what is it that we find troubling about Hegel if we're among those who find him troubling? It's an aspect of orthodoxy, small o, inherited certainly from a certain overly buoyant providentialism. I mean, an absolute dualism is a very grim thing indeed, but so would be a narrative monism unqualified by any Gnostic detachment, irony, sedition, or doubt. By any proper sense, that is, that this world is horribly out of joint, that we are prisoners of delusion, that evil enjoys no divine necessity. Nothing then is pure privation or ultimate evil. In some sense, so this sort of Christian fears, this view of things affirms that even war is good, that the Weltgeist strides across history's stage at the Battle of Jena or at any other battle, perhaps, and that spirit comes to itself in the death of a child no less than in a gesture of love. But if all of that were true, and I'm not saying it is, but if it's true, it's certainly not the return of some suppressed Gnosticism. One might more plausibly see it as an extreme expression of something peculiar to magisterial Protestantism. A delight in divine sovereignty so total that even at the end of the day, the devil becomes one of the masks of God. Now, one too might wonder whether this reasonable providential vision is sustained by the latent presence of something prior to and indomitable by all reason, a sort of spontaneous power of becoming as original as the concept itself. I don't know if it is, but I have to skip my reflections on it, which are very brilliant. Actually, they're not, but they're colorful. Something somehow more primordial than rationality or identity, an intentionality prior to its own rationale, since, as Hegel explicitly says in the Phenomenology, at least there, that the final cause of Geist can reside nowhere but in Geist itself as an end achieved. So sub specie aeternitatis, of course, there is only a rational totality in which all causes, even the final causes, are present as a replete rationality, but it's precisely the species aeternitatis that's been rendered amphibulous. But I will put all that aside. And anyway, what we're really talking about is not so much Hegel, but the presence at this moment in Christian thought, when it became possible to think in terms of an indeterminacy and a willing in God and a dynamic process in God that more plausibly can be traced to Jakob Boehme, perhaps, but Boehme was no Gnostic. He was a Lutheran. All right, let me try to sum up. There can be something exhilarating in the way the brute historical momentum of a large but unstable idea can carry it through every possible transmutation until it arrives very nearly at its own opposite. There's also a long passage here about this possibility of a divine voluntarism in Burma going back well into the Western tradition, late medieval thought, even perhaps to the late Augustine, but I'll skip all that because it's obvious. But basically, the moment the moment when theology ceases to conceive of God's acts towards creatures in a way for any rationale could be adduced other than the mysterious sovereignty of its own exercise, the first ectoplasmic wisp of the specter of an indeterminacy within the divine was summoned up. I assume that in some ways we could think of what happens in Hegel as an attempt to correct a certain rupture between rationality and intentionality in Western Christian thought, 40 seconds, and specifically Protestant thought, but also one of its predictable consequences. It came at a dizzying moment when all seemingly fixed binary oppositions of Christian philosophy showed that they could shift or reverse polarity. Certainly we know what the history of much continental Lutheran thought, especially from that period onward, was. I mean, the infinite God of absolute volition could be inverted into infinite indeterminacy, willfully becoming spirit, God willfully positing a history of predilective predestination as an act of omnipotent sovereignty, being inverted into God sovereignly determining and electing himself in and through history, the Trinitarian God choosing to save and to damn as an act of perfect libertarian freedom inverted into a unitary divine source of being, electing to become Trinity and then through the drama of history. You can see how this works. And so when the Hegelian system arrives amid this glorious flux and attempts to impose a rational structure and a kind of final causality upon that flux, it does not necessarily in the process entirely free itself from the conceptual configurations it seeks to overcome. And therein lies what troubles us, not a Gnostic dimension. And it's one perhaps that makes one wonder whether a true renewal of Trinitarian ontology should involve indispensably an attempt to ask ourselves whether the recovery of that a certain Gnostic irony, is itself part of the project of a new Trinitarian ontology, or whether we should indeed consent to its complete abandonment. I have to confess, I think the former rather than the latter. So thank you. I'm sorry I didn't get to the end properly, but I'll stop there.
Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Isabelle Moulin. She is currently Associate Professor at the Catholic Theology Department of the University of Strasbourg. She previously taught at the University of Notre Dame as invited scholar, the Catholic University of Paris, and the Collège des Bernardins as assistant and associate professor. She has specialized in ancient and medieval studies, especially the theology and philosophy of Albert the Great. She has published an introduction and translation of the 11th book of his Metaphysica and a book on Hugh of St. Victor's Conception of the Sacraments. She has edited several books in medieval studies for the collection of the Institute of Medieval Studies of the Catholic University of Paris at Fresnes. She is preparing a book on Albert the Great's theology and has recently explored a new field of research, the metaphysics of beauty and its relation to theological thinking. She will give her paper titled Repetition and Representation, Reaching Eternity Through Beauty. Please welcome Isabelle Moulin.
So, yes, is it working? Yes, it's working, sorry. I would like to thank, of course, the organizer of the conference, and I would take 30 seconds of my time to thank especially the students, the graduate students who have organized this conference. We hope we were speaking about it with Olivier Bounois, and we hoped we could have the same thing in France, but we are quite desperate about the possibility to have such devoted students. So thank you very much for what you have done and the gift that you have done for us. Thank you. So my paper is on repetition and representation, reaching eternity through beauty. The doctrine of Trinity constitutes the true originality of the Christian conception of God. Considering the actual necessity of interreligious dialogue today, it is the most challenging dogma, as it is impossible for human creatures to explain the essence of God, let alone demonstrate his Trinitarian nature. The ontological gap between the Creator and his creatures precludes, from the outset, any scientific rationalization, in a modern sense of the word, of God's being. In a certain way, Rémy Brague is certainly right when he says that the doctrine of Trinity is a way for Christians to describe the essence of God without contradicting his unity and unicity. In this paper, I would like to explore a way of considering identity and difference through the concept of repetition and analyze its fecundity to understand the Trinitarian God. For this purpose, one needs to rule out the logical and analytical aspect of repetition. Identity through repetition is not a duplication of being as in a mere tautology. The reiterative dimension of repetition, as suggested by the suffix re, cannot be reduced to a reposition of the same. It is therefore fundamental to study this notion within a realm that gives sense to differentiation. I will then show that repetition is a representation, a re-instantiation, or better said, an extension of presence in a Bergsonian way of speaking, which allows the union of both identity and difference and makes it possible for man to grasp divine eternity. Indeed, human nature cannot escape duration, and its proper way of reiteration takes place in time. But repetition, in its similarity with God, opens to an experience of an extended present. Such an experience occurs within a domain that needs to be both internal and external to the bearer of the experience. The experience of beauty answers such requirements, though beauty is certainly not the only one. My contribution will then show how repetition, which articulates identity and difference, accounts for the reappropriation of time by human creature through the experience of beauty, without appealing to the Hegelian dialectical nor the Nietzschean cyclical conceptions of time. Kierkegaard is the first thinker to unite both repetition and aesthetics. I will show that his conception of aesthetics prevents him from understanding the importance of the representation at stake in the experience of beauty. As a counter example, I will closely study the French novelist Proust's conception of beauty. That leads to a renewed conception of time. I will then draw some conclusions from a theological point of view and apply them to the relationships between the Trinitarian God and human beings and to some aspects of the religious life, especially in liturgy and pastoral. For the demonstration, I need to deal with 4 concepts, that are closely correlated: repetition, difference, representation, present as duration through repetition, and beauty as the experience of the correlation of the 3 other concepts. So first, repetition and beauty, the limits of Kierkegaard's aesthetics. Repetition and representation in the experience of the difference. And the second part is announced. The concept of repetition is central in Soren Kierkegaard's works, especially in his essay, Repetition, published under the name of Constantin Constantius. As Catherine Pickstock has clearly demonstrated in her work, Repetition and Identity, repetition stands ontologically and theologically as non-identical. In other words, it is the milieu where identity, repetition as return, touches the difference, non-identical. Such a concept is not purely dialectical, it implies experience and a relation to time. Though the Greek concept of reminiscence seems to be the equivalence of repetition, it fails to capture the blissfulness moment of time as instant. The Greek anamnesis considers time upside down, according to Kierkegaard. The doubling of being in the case of reminiscence implies a remembering of the past idea. The repetition occurs backward towards the past, whereas the true repetition implies a remembering forward towards the future. Such an act, which could appear as contradictory, is not reduced to mere anticipation, and as in the case of hope, it is the true enjoyment. It is a true enjoyment of the instant. Anticipation is cowardice. Remembrance is sensuality. Repetition, on the contrary, is defined by life through joy and beauty. I'm still dealing with Kierkegaard here. The repetition is then a gift of God, without which no creation would ever have been possible. Living the instant is to share some part of divine eternity. The instant is neither instantaneity, the constant iteration of a moment in a pure flowing time, nor pure memory, or revival in the present of the being past, but it is the expression of a duration, the encounter between eternity and the occasion. The repetition occurs first in the experience of a suffering, the event of a crisis, as the loss of all possessions and a happiness for Job, or the loss of his son for Abraham. But such a suffering is only the testimony of the irruption of the transcendence, and is the sign of the beginning of a repetition. Job receives everything in double. The repetition is then the remembering forward, because it is not only a renewal and once and for all, the act of doubling reiterates itself constantly as long as man is open to transcendence. Such a repetition includes difference without the dialectical negative aspect, since it is experienced in the very existence of man. The negative aspect of the difference is endowed with the event of contradiction and suffering, but happens in the rest of the life of the subject. Without the spatial dimension of the limitation, and without the reduction of the difference to non-being, as would be the case if the difference was thought in terms of opposition. Gilles Deleuze has clearly demonstrated the affirmative aspect of difference, which cannot be reduced to a moment of a greater identity, as in the case of representation in the common sense of the term, or to be reduced to non-being, as in the case of the Parmenidean one. For a Trinitarian ontology, such a conception of difference is fundamental. Difference needs to be affirmative if the theologians want to avoid Sabellianism and understand the notion of relation in God. It is also convergent with the eternal dimension of the procession, perichoresis, since the representation is specifically a way for creatures to recapture a sense of eternity and duration through their timely life condition. Finally, as it is not mere non-being, it is not incompatible with the conception of Trinity itself, as it is not purely tautological identity. My second point, according to Kierkegaard, so that was repetition according to Kierkegaard, now conception of aesthetics. According to Kierkegaard, human life constantly has to deal with repetition. However, true repetition can only be found in the religious state. His conception of the three stages, aesthetical, ethical, and religious, is well known, of course. Aesthetics is not a good candidate of repetition. It is not devoid of repetition, but such a repetition is totally sterile. It cannot understand the paradoxical dimension of interiority. If the poet tries to go beyond the seductive dimension of repetition, he experiences the non-repeatability of the experience of beauty, as in the case of a second trip to a well-remembered town. Aesthetics suffers from three radical impediments. It appeals to the senses, takes place in an instantaneous present, and escapes true internal subjectivity. Eros, as a principle, object, or self-love, is all too external to the subject. Consequently, the arts are ineffective to catch a glimpse upon divine eternity. Kierkegaard is a true representative of the conception of aesthetics based on senses and pleasure, in which art is belittled. Such a reductive conception of art, and indirectly beauty, a romantic conception of beauty, I would say, runs the risk of being detached from the transcendental of goodness, but also precluded from the religious realm. Olivier Boulnois has demonstrated that such a conception of aesthetics is non-applicable in the Middle Ages. However, if one detaches beauty and art from aesthetics, there is a way to regain the repetition and the representation that Kierkegaard has applied to the religious state through a true metaphysics of beauty. I think that such a metaphysics can be extracted from the French novelist Proust. It's my counterexample to Kierkegaard. Marcel Proust specifically uses the art of writing to show how repetition invites us to reconsider time through the medium of beauty. And repetition and time are what we need to open to a new Trinitarian ontology. So I have chosen a French novelist. I'm sorry, but since he was not Christian, I think it was ever more the case to show how we can reach Trinity through even with someone who is not specifically Christian. So it's a challenging task, but we'll see what's going on with this. The ontological experience of eternity through artistic creation in the work of Marcel Proust. Repetition and representation are the two central notions that can describe Proust's conception of art based on the living experience of the inner self. He belongs to this specific period of time. I know if you have Henry James and also Faulkner, and so that's a stream of consciousness period. So that's why it's easy to find something of the inner self with this novelist. According to Proust, human nature is composed of a series of events, gesture, act, sensation, piled up in a three-dimensional fashion at different levels of depth and height. The richness of these vases exceeds their relation to time, and within the interiority of the subject, they stand as possibly simultaneous through the action of memory. In the two famous extracts of Time Regained, Proust shows how the action of memory drives the inner self to the ultimate grasp of eternity and felicity. So the experience of repetition and extratemporality. In his Time Regained, Marcel Proust expresses three experiences that are emblematic of the sensation he has discovered, a sensation of intense blissfulness and extratemporality, two uneven paving stones, the knocking of a spoon against a plate, the stiffness and starchedness of a napkin. And note that I'm not quoting the famous Madeleine. all apparently insignificant experiences that transport the narrator outside time and unveil to him a being, making its appearance only when, through this identification of the present with the past, it was to find itself in the one and only medium in which it could live and enjoy the essence of things, that is to say, outside time. End quote. They are not experiences of present, for the senses cannot nourish them, nor, strictly speaking, experiences of the past, for imagination supplies an absence. And the experiences are vividly present to the mind of the narrator. Such experiences are nonetheless extremely real, he says, as they provide an, quote, immediate enjoyment, end quote, in the life of the self. They are described as the miracle of an analogy, a way for the narrator to show the connection between two states without the differentiation of time. The notion of extratemporality must be understood not as devoid of time, but different from the temporality of the being. It is called by Proust a pure time, in which past and present coexist simultaneously in the conscience of the perceiver. It is an experience of the concrete being, of the very existence of thing in a suspended time, like Boethius' tota simul. And I've provided a scheme, or whatever you call it. You have to go from left to right, pure pleasure, to the ontological experience of reality through the coexistence of imagination and sensation, past and present, that happens in pure time. In such an experience, memory has its role to play, but its involuntary aspect is only the occasion to join two vessels of the self. The will implies facticity and representation. As long as the narrator tries to recapture willingly the past sensation, memory deepens the self into uniformity, a fake representation of identity. Such a fallacy in the use of memory experienced by the narrator has induced some readers to accentuate the involuntary character of memory in the process. In a text about the style of Flaubert, Marcel Proust has warned the reader of a common misconception about his work. Involuntary memory is only the mean used by the narrator to connect one surface or vessel of the self to another, because memory is purer than fact. The repetitive associative act of the involuntary memory has nothing to do with a true repetition. The process experienced is not simply the self-pleasure of a rediscovery of a past sensation, but the delivery of the ontological truth of the essence of things and of the self. As far as memory is concerned, the reader needs to avoid two misconceptions of repetition. His second trip to Venice, walk once more, me repromener, or Balbec, return to retourner, provides no pleasure to the narrator of the research, like the Kierkegaardian traveler of Berlin. The aesthete art lover is lost in a bulimia of artistic events that never nourishes him. The willing memory belongs to the art lover. However, on the other side of the scale, the enjoyment does not come from the pure sensual, aesthetical aspect of the involuntary memory. Such a conception would mix the mean and the end. True repetition is a renewal, that is to say, a difference lived within the coexistence of sensation and imagination, present and past. Sorry, I missed. The novel has qualitative difference. What about intelligence? It is firstly put aside due to its desiccating action and its interest in utility, something like Bergson. But such impressions of the self are lost if they are not formulated and communicated with the help of language. They need to be fixed and expressed, and its aspect of beauty needs the medium of art. Art is even the best medium. Swann, a double of the narrator, and successfully tried to transform it into love instead of artistic creation. For a novelist, philosophy is in the form of the essay is not an option, but we know that Proust has been tempted by this solution. We maybe had Proust as a philosopher instead of a novelist. Art, in this case, the art of writing, will then stand as the issue of the partly subjective and incommunicability of the impression. Art is thus the mise en lumière of truth through the manifestation of the difference, and the intelligence is the light. True subjectivity of the artist perceives a qualitative difference. which has to be true difference. Intelligence has two functions, alignment and generalization, but I think that I would skip this part. So alignment and generalization, but I will give my conclusion on this part. With the help of intelligence, art transforms a subjective repetition to a repetition where some differences are lost, but some universality is regained. The artist can hear again, re-entendre, hence understanding that the experience can be renewed. Proust says quelque chose de renouvelable. You know, the suffix re, constantly repeated. Duration, writes Proust, needs the general, even if difference is doubly kept in the artistic process through the original experience of life and through the vision given by the artist. The concept of repetition is therefore useful to understand the relationship between identity and difference, as long as it is a qualitative repetition versus quantitative, taking place in time versus space, and appealing to all the faculties of the self, senses, imagination, memory, intelligence. The theologian might want to explore the fruitful dimension of the notion of qualitative repetition for a better grasp of the Trinitarian God, provided one keeps in mind the fundamental gap between the creator and the creatures. The creature reaches eternity through time, through the unity of his defected faculties and through the limitation of his/her nature. Proust's experience teaches us that the self does not only reach some sort of eternity, but also takes pleasure in it. Considering the ontological gap between creator and creatures, it seems that what is pure goodness and eternity in God is pleasure and representation in human beings, and that the creative art allows him/her to partake in the creative act of God. I have a conclusion, if you allow me 1 minute. My intent was to explore the use of the concept of repetition for a Trinitarian conception of God, but the theologian has to face a radical ontological equivocation between the creator and the creatures. Consequently, such a concept needs to be explored within the created realm. For God, repetition that could characterize the Trinitarian relation between identity and difference takes place in true eternity. But creatures are endowed with temporality. The experience of repetition for creatures needs to take place in time, but it is noteworthy that their true repetition occurs along with a sense of eternity that can be called duration for Bergson, extended present for Kierkegaard, extratemporality or pure time for Proust. I have called such a sense representation, which I think is the best way to express both repetitive and timelessness, eternal presence, experience. There are different ways for creatures to experience true repetition. I have chosen the case of beauty and its application in art, though not all artistic expressions are due to deal with beauty. For that purpose, I needed to deconstruct Kierkegaard's position, who forbids to make any relation between what he calls aesthetic and repetition. I needed to find a counterexample. I'd chosen Marcel Proust, but Vasily Kandinsky could have offered similar outcomes. Two main conclusions can be drawn from what I hope I have succeeded to demonstrate. Beauty is a way to grasp the divine, and either in its natural dimension or artistic one. Art can then be a domain where something, I think it's important for artists to know that, art can be a domain where something that belongs to the divine can be found, but also can be theologically expressed. Repetition is, as Kierkegaard has rightfully demonstrated, a way for created beings to live in a certain way the life of God, not simply in its essence, but more decidedly in its Trinitarian dimension. I do not pretend that the experience of beauty and its communication in art is the sole place where creatures and creator ontologically meet, but I think it could help to better understand the necessary connection between art and religion, especially in the case of liturgy. And that's my last sentence. The qualitative repetition deals in a specific way with identity and difference, in which identity and difference are both truly affirmative. But it can also help understand why our religious life is constantly punctuated with repetition. reiteration of most of the sacraments, recurrence of the spiritual life through prayers, acts of charity, rumination of the scripture, and so on. It affects so much the spiritual life that it is not rare to hear the believer complain. But such a complaint is only meaningful if the repetition is quantitative. In the realm of quality, the Eucharist can be constantly repeated in order to reach some part of the living eternity. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Professor Catherine Pickstock, is Norris Holt's Professor of Divinity, working in the area of metaphysics and poetics. She is just finishing a book called Aspects of Truth. As has already been noted several times this conference, Professor Pickstock has been absolutely pivotal to the success of this conference, and on behalf of the organising committee, we are deeply grateful for all of your support with this conference. So, thank you. Professor Pickstock's paper is titled Rivalry, Sacrifice and the Trinity, a study of the east door panels of the Florence Baptistery.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to the organisers for letting me have the final slot. Although I have done one or two things to help the team, it was only in a backroom sort of way. And so I thought perhaps I could do something useful by bringing us perhaps down to earth in the final slot with some doors. They're actually the ones facing the other way, but anyway, last minute PowerPoint with the help of Alex. So in the year 1401, a contest was held between the artists Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi for the commission to execute the design of relief panels for the east door of the Baptistery building of the Duomo in Florence. Scholars have seen the event of this contest as symbolically marking the beginning of the Renaissance and the rise of the cult of the individual artist. Nevertheless, there were several literary and artistic precedents for such a competition in the medieval city republics, and personal rivalry between competing artificers in the Middle Ages was by no means unknown. Dante indeed cites several examples in the Commedia, and panegyric inscriptions of the 13th century increasingly imitated the laudatory style of late antiquity. Artists were beginning to be praised for their personal and unique achievements, their unequaled ingenium, dignitas, claritas, and aptitude, and such inscriptions became increasingly competitive in tone, comparing a particular artifact's skill favourably or unfavourably against that of another. This increasing concern with individual reputation became a source of anxiety, for it presented an infringement of the Christian principle of humility. Such artistic competitions brought together a twin problematic of agone on the one hand, or rivalrous combat, and fama, or fame, on the other. A Christian anxiety in the face of this double vaunting was often placated by great works of charity, bequests, or acts of penitence, offered to atone for the personal aggrandizement afforded by winning a competition. If, however, these aspects of rivalry had begun to inform the commissioning of artistic works, why is that of the baptistery doors especially held to inaugurate agonistic protocols of early humanism and the Renaissance? The main reason... Oh, something's happened. Is it? Oh, it's okay. Okay. The main reason is that a new contrivance and a new criterion here entered the vocabulary of the competition's adjudicators, that of realism. The technical reasons that tipped the scales in favour of Ghiberti's design, and that's the one, oh, you can't really see very well, but it's this one up here, there. But anyway, maybe look it up online, you'll see a better copy. Ghiberti's design was that it attained to greater verisimilitude. its perfection lay in its exactness of copying. This novel standard introduced an even greater agonistic factor, for here was a measurable artistic aptitude or value, which ironically deflected attention from the actual scene depicted in its specific mode of depiction to questions of outdoing one's rival's attention to reality. But if the Renaissance is characterized by an intensified sense of personal reputation, it is also known for continued and equally intensified anxiety about this social phenomenon. The increase in rivalry for honor was matched and balanced by an increase in a worry about the very custom of honoring. And in the case of the contest between Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, this concern was brought to an extreme. For whilst earlier artistic competitors had sought to mitigate the problem of fame by means of charitable benefactions, Ghiberti and Brunelleschi effectively found a more complex expiation, which hinged upon the choice of subject matter given to them, namely Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. This story reproaches from the outset the very context of the artist's dealings with fame or concern with one's reputation in following generations. For Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac does not simply threaten the removal of Abraham's own future lineage, it threatens the dismissal of a whole people, and therefore of the possibility of being remembered and celebrated by one's descendants, and thus the very condition of possibility for reputation, for fame itself. For Isaac represented the future of Israel. In his loins were contained the seed of a whole nation. If the topic of the competition panels reproached all aspirations to fame, so also did the manner of depicting the scene by the competing artists. This occurred in at least 3 different ways. First, although Ghiberti and Brunelleschi were undoubtedly pursuing realism as part of an individualistic agone, the more realistic their depictions became, the more closely their contribution seemed to dissolve into the actuality of a continuing atoning sacrifice offered by the individual to the city for all to admire, and thereby to advance, without competition, the devotions of all. Secondly, if a competition nonetheless persists in the rival offering of these works of potential absolution, as in the rival offerings of Cain and Abel, later also depicted on the doors, even this is reproached by their own mode of depiction of the scene. Realism is itself negated, together with its accompanying agone, because all that is ever realistically depicted is the not quite happening of the sacrifice. Both Ghiberti and Brunelleschi's competition panels capture the scene at the moment of the staying of Abraham's knife. But there is a third reason why the story depicted undercuts the battle for ever greater realism. The context of the doors, the Florentine Baptistery, places upon that scene a self-cancelling freight. Here, the sacrifice of Isaac fulfills itself as it effaces itself, in pointing as a typological figura to Christ's actually fulfilled sacrifice. That this prototypic self-cancelling scene is merely transitional, a stage on the way to the consummate Christological sacrifice to end all sacrifice, is dramatized by the fact that it is designed for the Janus-faced doors of the baptistery. A 2-dimensional relief, which merely gives the illusion of the real, is here shattered or exceeded when one passes 3-dimensionally through the picture and into the reality of baptism, or initiation into identity with the God-man and his death. Instead of a dubious realism, which can only be reached through rivalry, one has a reality that must be lived and cannot be depicted, which can only be reached through self-sacrifice. Instead of mimetic rivalry, one has the living sacrifice of love. The flat spell of competition and representation is broken when one passes existentially forward into the existential fullness of the new covenant, just as the visible but hidden seal of circumcision, instituted by Abraham, is broken by pointing typologically to the invisible but public mark of baptism. In this passing through into the womb of Christ's body, the church, therefore, one passes from the arts of imitation into what Plato called in the Laws the true tragedy, the actual scenes themselves, and no longer their anticipations, shadows or relief sculptures, although the shadows and reliefs are part of that reality and help us to make sense of it. Representation is achieved in its very cancellation. By passing through the doors, one immediately completes their realism by becoming in actuality what they prefigure. In participating in the fulfillment of their typology, one constitutes, as it were, their missing third dimension. But there's more besides this. In one's real enactment, one redeems the agon of self-expression. For in becoming oneself the work of art, passing beyond art as mimetic realism, one surpasses the potential of rivalry. Performance strives simply to become itself, rather than competitively to become by copying something else. One moves to a realm where to achieve oneself in and as a work of art is to achieve something incomparably unique and incomparably self-remaining. There is room for an infinity of individual excellences, which can scarcely be compared with one another. By passing beyond representative realism as the measure of either art or morality, an exactness of depiction, or an exactness of adherence to an ethical norm, one goes beyond the idea of value, which is a measurable thing on a scale. Rather, one has recovered a sense of the good as something that can be only participated in a myriad of different ways. Between these ways can lie a mysterious and resonant echo, rather than the lethal, if sotto voce, din of social battle. To walk into the space of unique personhood in relation with other persons, beyond imitative rivalry, is to walk into the ontological space of the Trinity. The three-dimensionality of liturgy, enacted beyond the two-dimensional doors, is a figure for this. For since one cannot encompass three dimensions all at once, since there always remains some aspect of a three-dimensional object which remains hidden, three-dimensionality is inimical to perfect copying. One is here beyond competition, because there can be many equally valid surmises as to what constitutes the hidden dimension. Conjectures as to one's neighbour's hidden depth and the hidden depth of God. By moving through the doors towards the font in fulfillment of Abraham's sacrifice, one fulfills the way in which the story of Genesis points towards the Trinity. It does so because Abraham foreshadows God the Father's offering of the Son to the world through the bond of love which passes between them. We note that on Ghiberti's final panel, he depicted the scene of Abraham's vision of three angels under the oak at Mamre, traditionally interpreted as a vision of Abraham's worshipping of the triune God. Inversely, the triune God remains the thrice holy God of Abraham and of the Jewish people. We do not merely advance from error to reality, leaving imperfect conjecture behind, any more than one can on earth abandon one's imperfect struggles to depict mystery, and the inevitable contestations that will arise around this, which one must nonetheless seek to temper with love. One must pass through the doors into the inner sanctum of cultic initiation, but the only way to secure a sanctum is to build an edifice around it, and an edifice must first be entered. And most mysteriously, even the ambivalent social negotiations and sometimes excessive, if well-meant gestures of a still competitive piety that one must take within fallen time have somehow been transfigured and lifted up into the Godhead. The fact of the incarnation and the cross reveals that the triune God is eternally, and not just for us, also the God of Abraham, a God from all eternity linked with a strange and specific set of temporal events, a God connected in his inner sanctum of cultic initiation to the cosmic doors of human historical admittance. The most dramatic disclosure of the Trinity in the New Testament is a restaging of the scene of foundation that is the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. If the latter concerns the foundation of Israel and the institution of the rite of initiation into Israel, namely circumcision, then the disclosure of the Trinity in Mark's Gospel account of Christ's baptism by John, as Graham discussed earlier today, concerns the foundation of the new Israel, which is the church, and the institution of its new rite of initiation. Nevertheless, this new initiation is structured by an economy which undoes and surpasses the protocols of rivalry, foreshadowed by the prophet Isaiah, who declared that whole nations are accounted mere dust upon the judgment scales, in a final judgment when the criterion will not be who is the best copyist, while the patient and meek will be renewed and will mount up with wings like eagles. The institution of this rite of renewal and reversal is infused with a protocol of self-sacrificial, non-rivalrous yielding. After me comes he who is mightier than I, the thong of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. Far from seeking to hold his own over against he who is to come, John the Baptist announces in advance the yielding of his own baptism to the mysterious, unknown future baptism of the Holy Spirit. One could say that he stands not just for the old covenant, but for the once lone God of that covenant, now revealed as the Father, whose truest mark, as with every loving father, is to make way for the coming of his Son. Mark's narrative offers a vertical and descending figure of the Trinity, but also an horizontal one of its earthly imitation through temporal process. This willingness to decrease for the sake of what lies ahead unravels the lineage of fame and constructs an asymmetrical reciprocity linked with the nature of baptism. For baptism is to do with the bestowal of names and legacies, establishing an unrepeatable identity which precludes rivalry by rendering it pointless. Such a different and novel citizenship is open to all. There is no privilege or criterion for entry. There is no competition to enter the city, just as this city is not focused on festivals of agonistic rivalry. Even the universal threefold name of God, within which one receives one's own specific name, is one which must yield, must itself be named. Jesus, who comes to baptize with the Trinitarian baptism of the Holy Spirit, himself undergoes the rite of baptism in the context of a mysterious cultic hinterland between Israel and the Church, which itself enacts the arrival of the historical echo of the eternal Trinitarian process. It is in this moment of Jesus' obeisance or self-effacement that his identity is disclosed and made receivable by us. The reversal of authority is dramatized when John's paternal naming is a bestowing of grace upon Jesus, in imitation of the eternal grace bestowed by the Father on the Son in the Trinity, which is only such because thereby the Father is equally engraced by the Son. The seemingly ironic reversal, whereby the reader knows that it is truly Christ who has come to bestow grace upon John, is not so complete after all. Read in terms of a Trinitarian figura, a mutual bestowing of grace is at work here, just as the baptism of John seems to suggest the reception of Christ himself into a kind of proto-church, almost into a zone of indeterminacy as between the church and Israel. This idea of a crucial transition being enacted within a Trinitarian space is confirmed by the circumstance that the moment Christ arose from the waters, the Spirit descended from the heavens, and his name was bestowed and exalted all at once. Thou art my beloved Son, with thee I am well pleased. In this narrative of the first transitional proto-baptism, we see the significance of the fact that in being initiated into the name of Jesus, one is initiated into the secret of the three names of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, always named at the instance of one's personal naming. The name Jesus is the name of a perfect yielding to the will of the Father, refusing rivalry with him. In this yielding, Jesus is identified as unique, precisely because he does not seek to copy the Father, since the Father's being is of itself the expression of the Son's absolute specificity. Paradoxically, because the Son does not seek to copy or appropriate the Father, he becomes the perfect likeness or image of God, his stamp of character, after which Isaiah inquired. Scriptural rejection of idolatry is here consummated in the performed shape of a perfect human life, analogous with the real walking through the doors and becoming a work of art in one's own life, as opposed to the stasis of a fixed two-dimensional image. The attainment of unique identity through self-abandonment is, however, not foreclosed within the circle of Father and Son. Their exchange of identity is abandoned to a bestowal beyond themselves. Both the Father and the Son together will into being in their joint gift of the Holy Spirit, a shared sense of their identity as of itself a third, fully hypostatic and personal reality, freely interpretive of the import of the Son's image, of its implications, without which it could not stand freely as an image beyond the paternal original at all. For every expression of any reality must always already have entered a third space of reception, if it is not to be sucked back indeterminately into the initial wellspring. A river is other from its source because it flows through a terrain. The statue of a person is other from that person because it is erected in a space containing both of them, where it may be encountered, like the baptistery doors. The Holy Spirit reaches out to and pre-contains all unique created identities, which reach their typical acme in spiritual persons, who include human beings. We can only assume these identities in a Trinitarian mode. They do not consist in an identical copying of Jesus, nor are they to be seized as an independent construction, but rather they are received through one's entering into the self-emptying waters of baptism. Here one receives one's identity as the gift of the Spirit, the third upshot of non-rivalry between two, in contrast to the reward for the victor of the agon between two competitors, which can only be given to one party. Here the gift of one's identity is the gift of harmony with the identities of others, attained by the blending of differences, but not their obliteration or subsumption, rather than, for example, the monadic imposition of one point of view rather than another. This pattern is no mere local ecclesial matter. Such calling by name into being characterizes the ontology of creation. We recall the stars, which are summoned by name into existence in Isaiah. If the bestowal of names, of unique, incommunicable designators, keeps pace with that of being, then is creation not itself a sign of perpetual baptism? Is it not also a sign of the futility of rivalry, since this summoning into existence shows that there is no pristine accomplishment of identity for which one might compete, which is not itself first fractured by anonymity and dereliction? Jesus is recognized as the Logos when he has been plunged into the waters of chaos. His utmost eminence is revealed through abasement and identification with nothingness, just as he is shown to be mightier than John when he has subordinated himself to him. Such a willing submission to this fracturing is the most noble estate to which, along with all of creation, one should aspire, the honor of pointing beyond oneself to that which is the source of one's being and the bestower of one's name.
About 12 minutes for questions. So if you want to raise your hand, if you have a question. Whereabouts? Oh, John.
There we go.
Sorry, I can't see you, John. Yep, down the front.
What an absolutely stunning triple conclusion. I think none of us can find very much to say, but I'd like to thank everybody. And a quick question to Isabelle would be, of course, Proust is very Bergsonian in certain ways, and I was already trying to make connections between Augustine and Bergson. I just wondered whether you have any thoughts about a comparison between the way Proust uses Bergson and the way Charles Péguy uses Bergson, both in relation, I think, to the question of time and repetition. Then in relation to David, this is more of a kind of gloss because, as you know, I fundamentally agree with you. And I agree, yes, the problem with Burma is that he's a Lutheran, not that he's a Christian esotericist. But I think one has to say that it's his, Lutheran take on that esoteric and Kabbalistic tradition. And maybe, one could play out just a little more the way there's an exacerbation of a Gnostic theme in Burma. What I mean by this is, yes, the pleroma isn't actually the Godhead, but nonetheless, this idea of a tragedy in the heavens and a descent downwards and then a rescue of that upwards is, as it were, projected back by Burma, beyond anything done by the Kabbalah into the ultimate Godhead itself. And I agree, he projects it back because he's a Lutheran, because of this idea of absolute divine determination. Nonetheless, in very, very, slight defense what Cyril is saying, you could see it as an exacerbation of Gnosticism. But the other remark with which I think you're going to fundamentally sympathize is that one of the implications, I think, of what you're saying is that this kind of Hegelian extremity is, in a sense, an extremity of orthodoxy more than it is of Gnosticism in the classic real sense, because there is more proximity than perhaps we like to think, between this Gnostic trope of descent and rescue and Orthodox Christianity, which already involves God himself in that descent and rescue, albeit not in terms of a kind of disaster in the absolute and the idea of the wickedness of this realm. And here, so if I could connect to Catherine at this point, at the end of repetition and identity, I think she very, very rightly says that you have to see that Irenaeus owes something to Gnosticism. That in other words, that when Irenaeus is criticizing Valentinus, that he much more introduces a dramatic element into Christian orthodoxy. It becomes more, he picks up at that point on this idea of something's gone wrong and you have to go through that process by recapitulation, so that it is, as it were, he's reworking a Gnostic trope, in a sense, to get to a stronger orthodoxy that won't just be, a story of a non-narrative ascending back upwards.
1, 2, 3.
Oh, sure. I'll go first. By the way, excuse me for going and skulking in the shadows over there, but I'm sort of a Gollum character, and I don't like to be seen too much. No, medication that was giving me a pounding head. These lights are very bright, and so by the end of my talk, that's why I was babbling about bananas and apple juice and things. Yeah, I mean, what you call Gnostic tropes, of course, actually could just be called Christian tropes. Right, yeah. Yeah. No, but the point is that you've seen the long version of this paper in which I go through a great number of scriptural pericopes and ask, in what sense the things that we're attributing to these Gnostics, other than a very bad metaphysics and a rather incontinent sense of mythopoesis, both of which are deplorable in their way, although entertaining at times too. what it is that somehow in the unfolding of a certain Christian tradition has come to be regarded as heterodox, even though in many ways it is not only rhetorically but conceptually far closer to the text of the New Testament, and what it takes its place, and what in fact strangely well, not just in Hegel, but in a whole host of other thinkers in the especially German tradition, make us reflect upon in a way that suddenly all at once troubles us, are in fact a certain strand of orthodoxy, one that in its time had bred, among other things, a kind of voluntarism, succumbing to its own volatility. And putting out ramifications in directions we hadn't anticipated. That's not really an answer to what you said because you didn't ask a question. So now I'm trying to think of a way of summing up that's extremely elegant. So over to you, Catherine.
You're too kind, David. Could I conclude by asking a question or posing a problem? I was in Florence about 2 weeks ago, hoping to get you a photograph of actually sort of walking through into the Baptistery. But I guess because of hyper-tourism, if you're going in through the doors now, I don't know if any of you have been there recently, there are armed guards and also military in military dress and large armoured vehicles in the forecourt of the Duomo, and pacing around the sort of soldiers with guns. And also, in order to go through the doors of the Baptistery, you now have to go through an airport security archway, which will detect whatever awful things we might have in our pockets. So it's very hard, really, to find a way of entering the Baptistery in the way that I might have suggested in my paper, sort of living this work of art now, and somehow the state of the world that we're in now makes it all the more difficult and perhaps crucial for us to find ways around this of living this word Trinitarianly. We've used a few times the last couple of days. It makes it harder for us now, and we need to try and think of ways of remembering that we're being taken up into the exchanges between the persons of the Trinity. It's pretty tricky when there's an armed guard and an airport security arch. Anyway, if you can add to ways of, help us think of ways to make this easier now. Maybe this is a new kind of Gnostic moment that needs to be recapitulated.
Isabelle, did you want to say something?
So as for your question about Bergson, Proust, and Augustine, I'm not going to speak about the familiar relationship between Proust and Bergson. I'm just interested in their thoughts. Some scholars say there are really an influence between both. Some wants to say, well, Bergson's duration has nothing to do with Proust because, as I said, Proust considers duration as, or the self, to be precise, as some sort of vessels. And you need to, and that's a coexistence of different vessels that explain the aesthetic, but I don't like the word, actually I'm trying to find another one, maybe philocally or something like that. But that's what creates the notion of pure time. So some scholars say Bergson thinks duration as a total unity without any discontinuity. And that's the example of the music, for instance. It is not the same if it stops 3 measures before or 3 after, so the self is in perpetual continuity. So some scholars say it's not the same as Proust because it seems that there are some kind of discontinuity within the vessels. But I've been thinking about it. I'm not so sure that they are right in a sense. because it's not exactly an extraction of a reminiscence, but it is more a collage, if you say that in English, I'm sorry, of two sensations that can be associated by involuntary memory. And I say associated, but the misconception of Proust is association. So I think there's really a sense of, there's a real relationship between Proust and Bergson. Now, it is true that I think that the importance of Bergson has been a lot under-evaluated, because I think that Bergson is a philosopher who can help to go beyond and after some conception of Kant, which has been so complicated and so difficult for us, I mean, even theologians, to overcome. So we had different possibility to overcome Kant. I'm sorry for him, but I don't want to put too much pressure on authors that also partake in the history of metaphysics. But Kant has posed us a lot of problems. And I think that Kant's conception of time is really problematic. And I think that, and it creates some, I would almost say some paradox. And so Bergson really, with his conception of duration based on the inner self and consciousness, helps us to understand how the Kantian conception of time is spatialized, is tinged, or I don't know the word, tainted with space. And how we always react when we think about time to space. And I think even our conception of substance, that's why Bergson was attacked on this question of being, even our conception of substance is tainted with space. So space is nice, but we need to have a good dimension of duration to be able to understand also what being is. So I'm sorry I've been a little bit long. As for Augustine, I think, well, it's always difficult again to compare two authors and they have each their way of thinking. It's true that the conception of Augustine in the Confessions can be, I think, can be compared to Bergson's duration. Bergson was quite influenced by Plotinus and Augustine, but that doesn't mean that Bergson is really following Plotinus anyway. But we have the similarity in the Confessions with a very well-known text about the extension of presence that we have in Augustine, and I think it's important. But we would have difficulties to say that Bergson is Augustinian, I think. Yeah.
Right, one last question up the back.
I'm sorry, I've been a little bit long.
Sorry, I'm going to go back to Gnosticism, may I, briefly? Because I think, can you hear me? Shall I be close? Okay.
Yes.
I agree with David and with John. I think they're both right. And I think Catherine shows us how. So I was wondering if I could just sort of draw a line between those three. Because, so what, David, you were talking about how Gnosticism isn't reducible, this is how I heard it anyway, isn't reducible to kind of what it tells us about the world, the myths. And it struck me that in the ancient world, of course, Gnosticism was distinctive for its approach to knowledge. So these were mystery cults, and they were distinctive because they offered truth to initiates. And to become an initiate, you had to go through a sort of process of rivalry, really. Only the strong and pure, spiritually pure, persevered and were initiated. And they were not the masses. This was a private religiosity which was not performed in temples, or the analogues of temples, so churches. And it just struck me that Catherine's paper so beautifully sort of showed what it is about Christianity that is really different from Gnosticism. Because I think David is right about if we think that Gnosticism is its myths, then we misrecognize that difference, because Christianity has those myths also and need parts of those stories. Otherwise, it becomes really boring. It needs the irony. What the real critical element of Christianity is in relation to Gnosticism is that it stakes everything and says it's open, it opens the doors. And Rivalry is sort of nonsensical, really. It's quite silly. It's a performance. Hence all the drama in mystery cults. You had to sort of pay a fee, and then you were shown this spectacle, and then sort of shown another spectacle, and so on. It's very much like going, to a May ball or something like that. Christian initiation is quite different and much stranger. So I just liked the way there was a very beautiful kind of symbiosis there. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Anyone want to respond to that?
Yes, you're absolutely right about everything, because you agreed with me. But also the historical evidence, of course, is somewhat mixed on this. There are scholars now who try to say that not all of those, and what is Gnosticism? I think the old characterizations fit the Sethian tradition, but then there are all sorts of questions about Eastern and Western Valentinianism where they fit. Some scholars have tried to suggest that many of these sects were not nearly as exclusive or hermetic or mystery-like in their concern, but I am not sure. I believe that's actually been adequately demonstrated. At the same time, part of what we've received as Orthodox Christianity clearly emerges from communities that did practice Christianity as something like a mystery religion. The Gospel of John is unintelligible if we don't see that there are mystagogical discourses about Eucharist and baptism that are intentionally veiled from the eyes of unbelievers. Now, that may not be a matter of class, but in principle, you're right. This is one of the extraordinary facts of what passes from Christ to the church. This constant and somewhat apocalyptic command always to go to the least of these, always to descend to those who are on the margins and rejected. And so the church obviously could not silence that voice at the heart of its proclamation. As a historical judgment, though, there are all sorts of ambiguities about the institutional expressions in those centuries. But yes, in principle, what you say is, of course, the whole point.
Right, let's thank our panelists. And we're going to go straight into the next concluding discussion. And so David and Isabelle are going to remain here and